Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate. And we have a really special guest today, which is why we're starting so early in the morning. Well, early for me, at least. I hate mornings. I'm just a less expansive personality, but I'm not going to be doing most of the talking. We're going to be hearing from Professor Mohammad Marandi, who is and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but professor of English literature at Tehran University, an analyst of regional affairs and international affairs. And I think someone we're really lucky to have on the program to help explain to us the situation that Iran kind of finds itself in after October 7th, and especially since Israel's brazen attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria and Damascus, which killed some 12 people, along with Syrian workers, Iranian embassy staff, and a top IRGC official. So welcome, Professor Marandi.
Thank you very much, Max, for having me.
And Siri on my phone just activated, so that's annoying. And welcome, Aaron.
Yes, and thank you, Aaron, for having me too.
Well, Professor, what's next? I mean, we could play some. We'll play some clips of some commentary, but I think the question on everyone's mind is, what's the next move for Iran? What is the thinking there, to the extent that you are clued into it, in how best to respond to an attack that obviously was aimed at forcing everyone, especially the United States, up the escalation ladder?
Well, if I go back a bit, maybe it's better. And we should keep in mind that the Israelis have carried out attacks on Iran on numerous occasions, both assassinations inside Iran, but also assassinations in Syria. And the Iranians have, until now, refrained from responding directly. And over the past, and the reason for that, from my understanding, this is my personal interpretation of the past, is that the Iranians were preparing the resistance for the last couple of decades for this moment in history. And the tunnels and the defense capabilities that we see in Yemen, in Gaza, in Lebanon, the capabilities that we see in Iraq and Syria, I think it's fair to say that this was a 20-year-long project. And therefore, I believe that in the past, when the Israelis attacked Iran, the Iranians decided that now is not the time. And we want to focus on our long-term objectives, and that is to empower this axis, the Gazans, the Palestinians, Hamas, Ansarullah, or the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah, the Hashid, or the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and of course Syria, which is a key country to help the different groups. So I think that's a major reason, at least, why the Iranians held back. Over the past 6 months, I think there's been a different reason, and that is that over the past 6 months, as the Israeli regime carried out a number of assassinations in Syria through airstrikes, they murdered a number of Iranian officers in that country. I think the Iranians felt that the focus has to remain on Gaza, and that the Israeli regime, Netanyahu, they want to change the narrative, make it about Israel and Iran, or Israel and Lebanon. And the Iranians thought that the most important thing was to keep the world's eyes on Gaza and the ongoing genocide. However, when Netanyahu and the regime decided to attack the Iranian embassy and kill a number of officers, including 2 senior officers, the Iranians felt that on the one hand, they have to respond because this is a direct attack on Iranian sovereignty. It's the embassy is like Iranian territory. And also, I think the Iranians felt that this is an opportunity to strike the Israeli regime because the international community sees this as much more ugly than the previous assassinations and murders. So, of course, when the Israelis, every time the Israelis bomb Syria, it's illegal because they're violating Syrian sovereignty, they kill Syrian soldiers. But still, an Iranian response, although it would have been legitimate, when an embassy is attacked this way and people are killed, the outrage is much greater, and that gives Iran a greater opportunity to strike back without the Americans and the Europeans being able to make much noise about it and for them to protest a great deal. Of course, they will protest and they will condemn Iran's response, but the rest of the world will understand Iran's position and why Iran struck back. So I think this more or less explains why Iran behaved the way it did in the past and why it has changed its position now. Personally, I didn't think, although I didn't want to discuss this because it's just a personal opinion, but I did not think that Iran would strike during the month of Ramadan for a host of reasons, which we don't need to get into. But I think that from here on, we should be waiting for an Iranian response. And I personally think that there will be a direct response from Iran.
What do you think Israel's goal was in striking the Iranian embassy in Damascus? Are they trying to do something that would cause an escalation that would then force the U.S. to get involved directly on Israel's side against Iran and its allies? What do you think their goal was?
Well, I think it's quite obvious that ever since the escalation since October the 7th, the Israelis have been fighting a lost cause. They've been losing the battles. They've been murdering tens of thousands of people, and as you know, the number of people who've died are far more than 33,000. I think that probably the real numbers by now are the number is probably over 50,000 because many are missing and many are dying because of a lack of medicine and a lack of food and similar reasons. So from the beginning, the Israelis were fighting. I think they didn't expect the sort of resistance that they faced, and at the very beginning of like on October the 8th or 9th and 10th, I spoke to people who are better informed than me about what goes on in the region, and they were telling me that this will be a very long war, and that the resistance is prepared for a very long war, and that the Israeli regime can't take Gaza. And I actually told a number of friends, because some of my Palestinian friends and others were very worried. I told them that Gaza will not fall, and it wasn't based on personal knowledge. It was based upon the information given to me by people who in the past when it came to Syria, when it came to other issues, they always turned out to be accurate in the information they gave. So from the very beginning, the Israeli regime was losing on the battlefield. And I must add that Hamas and Islamic Jihad and their other allies, their casualties have been very low. And the reason is that their capabilities are all underground, deep underground. They have many tunnels. The Israelis have not really discovered anything important so far. They have a large amount of ammunition. They have all the weapons that they need. Their hospitals are underground. Everything is underground. So the Israelis they cannot hit them. They're only bombing ordinary people. And these people come out, they fight the Israeli regime, and then they go back into those tunnels that have been prepared or that have been built for the last 2 decades. And as we speak, more tunnels are being built. And as we speak, they now have new members who've joined, and they have ammunition. They have more ammunition. They are prepared for a very long war. So the Israelis, as they moved forward, they began to understand that they've lost the war, and they've become more desperate, and they will probably go into Rafah, but that too will be even a greater failure, because Rafah is much more difficult for them than Gaza City. And the reason, there are a host of reasons, but one is simply because it is, I think, 3 times or 2.5 to 3 times more wide than Gaza City. It's much more difficult for the regime to make headway or to advance into Rafah. So they've lost the war, and the further they push, the worse it's going to get for Israel. So in my opinion, the Israelis are looking for a path to escape defeat or a path to victory. And the only way to do that is escalation. They could attack Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is far more powerful than Hamas. Hezbollah has much more, the tunnels are much more extensive. The territory is much much larger, and their weapons are much more advanced, because Hezbollah is not surrounded like Gaza. Lebanon is not surrounded. They have access to supplies. So there's a big difference between Gaza and Lebanon. So it would be very difficult for the Israelis to launch a war against Lebanon, because they would immediately have their key assets destroyed. Their key infrastructure would be destroyed. Their electricity would be gone. Their ports will be destroyed. Their gas installations will be wrecked. It's not a war that it'll just get much worse if they go for Lebanon. So it seems to me that the easiest path to escalation for them was to do something outrageous in Syria, which they've done repeatedly before. Now, they either thought that the Iranians would not retaliate, or that the Iranians would retaliate, or maybe they weren't sure. But when they struck, they should have known that the Iranians would retaliate. I think it was quite obvious that that would happen. So if they thought the Iranians wouldn't retaliate, then they could say that, well, we scored a win. We killed a number of Iranian officers, a couple of very senior officers, and that's a plus for Netanyahu. But if they thought that if they calculated that the Iranians would respond, then yes, it could be that they want to bring in the Americans, or I don't know if they really think that that will happen, but whether that is their calculation or not, the Iranians are going to respond. So while the Iranians want to keep the focus on Gaza and the genocide there, and the push for a ceasefire, a permanent and just ceasefire, regardless of what the calculations may be in Tel Aviv, the Iranians will strike, and I think it will be a significant strike.
Professor Marandi, what do you make of these rumors? And I mean, they're somewhat substantiated. I think maybe by Iran's foreign minister, that Iran believes it has received some sort of guarantee that the U.S. will not participate in any retaliation if it limits its own response exclusively to Israeli targets and doesn't attack U.S. interests in the region.
Well, I do know that the Iranians have informed the Americans that if they stay out of the way, then they won't be in any danger. And my understanding is that the Americans don't plan to get involved, but I may be wrong. But what I think is important to note is that the Americans are in a very, very vulnerable position. And I think they would probably want to become cautious. Let's say that for whatever reasons, the Americans got involved. The Americans are very vulnerable in Iraq. Their bases would be overrun or can be overrun very swiftly. They don't have any major bases there that can be defended from the Iraqi resistance. And if the Americans lose their foothold in Iraq, they'll lose their foothold in Syria. They need Iraq for Syria. In addition to that, in the Persian Gulf region, the Americans and some of their European allies have bases. The important bases are American. The Europeans, they can't do much. But all of those bases are vulnerable. But more importantly, those family dictatorships that host those bases, if there is conflict between Iran and the United States, they will be seen as hostile actors. They can't host American bases and say it's none of our business. And all of their oil and gas installations are literally in front of the Iranians. They're right on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And I think by now everyone knows about Iran's drone and missile capabilities and Iran's underground bases. So if there is conflict between Iran and the United States, that would really mean the collapse of the global economy. It wouldn't be like a major recession or a depression. It would be a very, very deep depression that we'll be seeing subsequently. So there is a sort of balance of terror between Iran and the United States, like during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union when the two sides had nuclear weapons. There is a sort of balance of terror here. And I don't think, therefore, that the Americans really want to press their luck.
Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Is there a sense at all inside Iran that there was an intelligence failure in this Damascus strike? Israel's bombed Syria hundreds of times. It's taken out people inside Beirut as well. And so to have such a high value official, several of them meeting in the consulate, even though consulates are supposed to be protected under international law, Israel doesn't respect international law. So is there a sense at all that, having these people have that meeting, that was a mistake, an intelligence mistake, knowing that Israel carries out these strikes and has Damascus heavily surveilled?
Well, obviously, if the Iranians knew that the Israelis would strike the embassy, they wouldn't have had these people there. And with hindsight, one can say it's a mistake. I would imagine, and I'm not involved in these issues, but I would imagine that these people thought that the Israelis would not be foolish enough to strike the embassy, because striking the embassy, as I said, gives Iran a long-awaited opportunity. The murder of Iranian diplomats or Iranian soldiers or officers or generals are all tragic. Anyone and many and a number of Syrians were also killed. And in many of these airstrikes carried out by the Israeli regime, young people are killed, children are killed, women are killed. But in this case, I don't think the Iranians expected that. But while this is tragic, I think that the Iranians didn't think they would do this because, as I said, this gives Iran an excuse. It gives Iran an opportunity to strike the Israelis hard. And the Iranians have been holding back for a very long time. It's not only about these people, it's about the people who've also been killed before. It's also about the assassinations that took place in Tehran. And it's about Gaza, and it's about the genocide. And so the Iranians have a host of reasons why they would like to have an opportunity to hit the Israelis and have the approval of the international community. Of course, the international community minus the West. But so I think the Iranians probably calculated that the Israeli regime would not be stupid enough to do this. I mean, let me be very clear here. I really think that if that the Iranians are not going to back down at all, and that we have passed the previous stage where we've reached a new stage in the resistance, and the Iranians are much more powerful today. Their allies are much more powerful today. If the Americans make a foolish move, if the Israelis make a foolish move, they'll hurt. They'll be hit badly. It won't be like Ain al-Assad next time round if the Americans do anything. I think we've shifted, as I said, to a new phase altogether. And so that's something that they have to take into account. And also, if the Israeli regime strikes back after Iran hits them, Iran will hit them back again, and very hard. And it won't be proportionate. The Iranians will hit Israel very hard. And the regime is a small regime, it's a vulnerable regime, and the Iranians have those capabilities. I think, while I don't know much about what goes on in Ukraine or elsewhere, but I think the world knows about Iran's capabilities, and I think the Israelis have learned a lot over the past 6 months, and also over the past 6 months, a lot has been learned about Israeli military capabilities and technology. So I think the Israelis miscalculated, and I think the Iranians didn't expect the Israelis to make such a miscalculation, because they will be the ones who lose the most.
And we see continued Israeli attempts at escalation and kind of a madman policy in what just took place in the past few hours. Israel has assassinated 3 sons of Ismail Haniyeh, who is one of the major figures in the Hamas Politburo, you could call it, former prime minister of Gaza, who is now in Qatar. They killed them in central Gaza. Just these are simply people associated with a political leader. And this is all happening as the Mossad chief David Barnea and CIA director William Burns are negotiating via Qatar with Hamas. The U.S. is directly negotiating with Hamas. So it doesn't seem like Israel is trying to, especially Netanyahu, doesn't seem like Netanyahu really wants to see these negotiations come to pass. The U.S. is calling for a 6-week humanitarian pause, a genocide vacation for Israel, and Hamas is demanding full ceasefire. And amidst all of this, we have an Israeli minister, Israel Katz, the foreign minister, Israel Katz, declaring that Israel will attack Iran directly if the retaliation to the embassy attack originates from Iran, in other words, and not from one of Iran's allies like the Hashd al-Shabi popular mobilization units in Iraq or even Hezbollah. Katz is, I don't think he's part of the war cabinet. I don't really see him as close to the decision making. This is just sort of propaganda, maybe, but it's an escalation in rhetoric. I guess the question would be, given Israel's posture here, whether it's towards negotiations with Hamas, Netanyahu's own, the perilous future that Netanyahu faces if there is a ceasefire, and Israel's determination to draw the U.S. in and escalate with Iran. I mean, you talk to some knowledgeable sources after October 7th. I don't know if you've been in touch with them or anyone else or what the general mood is like, but what is your sense, Professor Marandi, on Iran's readiness to actually engage in a regional war facing off with Israel and the U.S.? Because the potential response that you forecasted or outlined logically could lead to that.
Well, I didn't get the whole question, so if you could type it while I respond to a part of it,
Sure.
I'd be grateful. I think.
Can you hear me?
First of
Can you
all,
hear me
the
now,
fact
Professor?
that they. Yes, I can hear you.
So basically, the question is Iran prepared for the scenario of a regional war facing off against Israel and the U.S.?
Well, first of all, Ismail Haniyeh is, as we all know, a very senior figure in Hamas and one of the key figures in the organization. By murdering his three sons, the Israeli regime is strengthening Hamas, because we've been hearing rumors regularly from Hamas, from the antagonists of Hamas, that the leaders of the resistance, their families, are living it up, and they're living in palaces in different countries, and and while the people in Gaza are making great sacrifices. But we see that Ismail Haniyeh's family is as vulnerable as anyone else, and in fact, they're more vulnerable because the regime, the Israeli regime, intentionally strikes the families of members of Hamas. They go after their children and their grandchildren and their grandparents and their uncles. It's a truly evil and barbaric regime, and I'm surprised still that anyone could still support this regime, even in the United States. After all we've seen during the past 6 months, and I think the past 6 months have vindicated all of those people who've been saying that this ethno-supremacist regime is immoral and illegitimate, and that the only solution is for all people in the land of Palestine to be treated as equal human beings. I think that the Israelis have strengthened Hamas. Now, if this was an attempt to put off the ceasefire or to make it worse, I don't think it changes anything, because Hamas and its allies, Islamic Jihad, their conditions are clear. What they will accept for a ceasefire is clear. It's not going to change. Over the past few months, many were worried, even Hamas supporters or Jihad supporters outside of Gaza, that maybe the defense will collapse. But the resistance has been telling everyone from inside that we are in a commanding position. And they've shown that. Again, putting aside the tens of thousands of people who've been massacred, that's not their fault. That is the Israeli regime's brutality. And I think the greatest defeat, actually, of the regime is the genocide. I think the genocide has done more damage to the regime, and it will bring down the regime ultimately. Its defeat on October the 7th, its military intelligence defeat, its defeat during the past 6 months in Lebanon, on the border with Lebanon, in Gaza, or the American defeat in the Red Sea. All of these are important. All of these are key. But I think the fact that the Israeli regime has exposed itself to the world is the most important thing that comes out of this war, this genocide. And so, but I don't think that anything will change the chances for a ceasefire. A ceasefire will take place when the conditions that Hamas has set out are fulfilled. And Hamas in Gaza is, as I said, is in a very strong position. They're not vulnerable. They will, if the war goes on for another year, they will be able to carry out that war. Have no doubt about that. So the only way forward for the Israelis is either to end the war or to continue it as it is. And it's only going to get worse for the regime, because the world has turned against it, and people's animosity towards the regime are going to become increasingly entrenched. And now we're seeing increasingly public figures in the West, in the United States, turning against the regime. People like yourselves, you and other very good people, used to be, lone voices with a very heavy burden, but now you see many young people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, everyone, and older people from all walks of life, joining this resistance. Because the resistance is not just the military resistance, it's this resistance against this ethno-supremacist regime. It's global. So if the war goes on, even without expanding, the regime, things get worse for Israel. If the Israelis succeed in escalating the war, in Lebanon, they will fail. Against Iran, in any exchange, the Iranians will have the upper hand. The Iranians' drone and missile capabilities alone are much greater than that of Israel. The Iranians have been planning this for 20 years, not against Israel. Israel is nothing. Israel without the United States supporting it day and night is nothing. It's a vulnerable, it's always been a vulnerable, weak regime. Iran has been preparing itself for more than 20 years, but for 20 years it's been really preparing itself since the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq for war with the United States. They've been preparing themselves so that war does not happen. And the United States never chose to fight against Iran when Iran was much weaker than it was today. Remember, 10 years ago, Iran was an isolated country. The United States was in Iraq and Afghanistan a decade ago. A little more than a decade ago. It was in both countries. And then the Americans started the dirty war in Syria. And by the way, why did they start the dirty war in Syria? I think now some of our friends are beginning to wake up. When Iran was saying that the Americans are trying to overthrow the Syrian government in 2011 and 12, and Iran was saying the CIA is behind this, and Western intelligence agencies, and sadly, regional intelligence agencies were behind this, people would reject what we said. But then it came out, and you know this better than I. You've documented this. I don't want to go over it, and I know your audience is very politically aware, and I don't want to bore them. But when Jake Sullivan sent that email on February the 12th, 2012 to Hillary Clinton saying that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, that meant it was already on their side in 2011. It didn't start on February the 11th. So from the very beginning, the dirty war in Syria was coordinated between the Israelis, NATO, sadly, some of Syria's neighbors, and oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf. So imagine, back then, Iran was isolated. Iran was surrounded by America, the United States, and Syria was in deep trouble. Tens of thousands of foreign fighters were brought into the country. In 2013, Iran had to send to get involved to prevent the country from falling into the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then in 2015, the Russians came in too. So back then, when Iran was not nearly as strong as it is today, the Americans never dared attack Iran. And that's because they knew that Iran is not Afghanistan, it's not Iraq, it's not Libya, it's not Vietnam. It's all of these combined and much more. And of course, now Iran has allies across the region. The Americans failed in the Red Sea. When the Americans started, when Ansarullah, these unsung heroes, when they started, I mean, they are, I think they're the greatest heroes of the last 6 months. When they began to implement, of course, alongside the women and children of Gaza who were steadfast, but when they began to implement the siege on the Israeli ports, and they said it was to implement the Genocide Convention. From the very beginning, again, people here in Iran were saying, people who know more than me were saying that the Americans will fail in Yemen because all of these assets are underground. The drones, the missiles, the radar systems, everything, they come up, they fire their missiles or their drones, they go down underground. And they're all over the country. And the Americans, after 6 months and spending huge amounts of money bombing the country and firing missiles, they failed. So the Americans have failed in Yemen. How are they going to confront Iran militarily, especially with what's going on in Ukraine? The Russians are defeating the NATO-backed forces in Ukraine. The Americans have simply too much on their plate. This is not a winnable war for the United States. Is it? Am I saying that there will be no war? No, I'm not saying that. But I find it unlikely because I think there's still enough sane people in the military in the United States that recognize that this is not a war that the Americans can win. So I think this deterrence that has been created will prevent a war in the U.S. from escalating, but it's not impossible. If it happens, as I said, it will be catastrophic for the global economy. It will be catastrophic for Americans and Europeans, and meanwhile, the Russians will continue to advance on Western allies in Ukraine. And if the oil prices go through the roof, well, Russia's exporting millions of barrels of oil a day.
And I would add, with the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine failing and China and Russia moving closer together than ever before with the rise of BRICS, Iran is in a much, much stronger position than I think any U.S. analyst thought 20 years ago. The U.S. is obviously, the Biden administration especially, but I would also think a Trump administration would be determined to eventually pivot towards Asia, towards some kind of conflict with China. There's a giant summit coming up in Washington with Kishida, the Japanese leader, and it's all about rearming Japan. It's all about violating the Japanese constitution, getting ready for war with China. So I think these are all factors that would lead the U.S. towards a much more cautious posture vis-a-vis war with Iran. But we're coming up close to the hour. So, Aaron, I wanted to toss to you if you have any more questions.
Last question for me. if you read Western media coverage of Iran, the impression you would get is that there's a huge political force inside the country that doesn't want to support Palestine anymore, that wants the government to focus on domestic issues. What's the reality on the ground? Is there any significant political force inside Iran that wants to basically sell out Palestine? Because Iran has paid a price for supporting the Palestinian resistance for so long.
And I guess I would add, you know,
Yeah.
what was I would add just on to Aaron's question, what kind of opposition elements exist inside Iran that could actually function on behalf of Israel, like the MEK, could actually do damage?
Well, the Americans have a very, and the West has a very large anti-Iranian Persian media apparatus. Many TV stations in London, in the United States, in Europe. They have cyber armies, uh, a huge one in Albania where thousands of people are working day and night against Iran, the MEK terror organization that fought for Saddam Hussein against Iran in the 1980s. So they fought against their own country and for Saddam Hussein, and now they're working with the Americans. So the Americans have a huge anti-Iranian media, Persian media, that day and night pumps in disinformation, mixes truths and falsehoods, and that sort of thing, which you're both experts in. So, and I'm sure your audience knows quite a bit as well. So I won't go down that road and explain that any further. But then there's the sanctions. So the Americans have been trying to punish Iranians as much as possible. And the truth is that the sanctions over the past 4 decades, they're not about the nuclear program. They're not about human rights. They're not about terrorism. It's all about Israel. And if the Iranians were willing today to give up the Palestinian cause, imagine what the Americans would be willing to give to Iran. But the Iranians will never do that. So they will see this through. I have no doubt. But I think it's very clear that overwhelmingly Iranians have always supported the Palestinian people. And after what we've seen during the last 6 months, it's become even stronger and more entrenched. But in the past, we've always had a discussion about how much support we should give to Palestinians. And if you look at the different polls, I think in the past, the University of Maryland did some. There's some Iranian institutions that carry out regular polls. Most Iranians say that, yes, we should continue to support them. Some say do a bit more. Some say do a bit less. Some say don't support them, with weapons, but just with aid and that sort of thing. There are different views. But in general, the policy, according to polls, has been that most Iranians believe that Iran should continue to support the Palestinian movements with through different means, meaning whatever it takes, whatever is necessary. But there will always be people who oppose it. There are people who oppose it now, but these people, I think, are smaller in number. I think maybe a couple of years ago it would have been that minority would have been larger. But I think that the last 6 months, has been devastating for the Israeli regime, and it's been devastating for the United States and for the Europeans. I think the sacrifice that the United States has made for the Israeli regime and the Europeans, with the sacrifice that they've made for the Israeli regime, and the Canadians and the British and the Australians, is very difficult, if not impossible, to calculate. They've destroyed their credibility across the world. And in Iran, many young people in Iran are unhappy with the government, with the economy, with the lack of opportunities. Iran has many problems. It's by no means a utopia. And there are very legitimate criticisms about many things in Iran. But many of those young people or older people from different walks of life, who have been highly critical, many of them had been, over the past few years, influenced by Western narratives about the West and how the West supports human rights and how the West, how civilized it is and how the governments reflect public opinion and how and that sort of thing. That's been destroyed. That's been utterly crushed and demolished. That is not a narrative that anyone accepts anymore. And so, in a sense, all I would imagine, all adversaries of the United States are strengthened as a result. Because if I'm critical of this administration, and I think something out there is much better, and then it turns out there it's much worse, then gradually my views on what I have change. That doesn't mean that everyone in Iran is happy. No, many people are dissatisfied, many young people are dissatisfied, and many criticisms are valid. But the West has destroyed its image in the country. And I think you can say for certain that other countries across the global south are facing a similar pattern.
Well, fantastic analysis as always, Professor Marandi.
Thank you.
We in our audience are really lucky to have access to it, and obviously this is something we're going to be following throughout the week. I personally, well, I'm not going to make any predictions, but I've learned to not to expect responses from Iran when we least expect it. And meanwhile, I mean, we'll be talking about it for the rest of this stream. The grenade in the tank of Western hegemony has already kind of exploded, and we're just seeing the repercussions play out right here in Washington, with, as you mentioned, a kind of a complete loss of credibility. There's been just a serial misunderstanding of the Palestinian issue, that it could just be put in the icebox, that normalization could take place, that the US and Israel could just go over the heads of Palestinians. And it's just all of these assumptions and delusions have blown up in the faces of the people who have been promoted despite declaring that Al-Qaeda, chirping that Al-Qaeda was on our side in Syria. So it really is a momentous time. We're also going to be talking about later in this stream, global South countries taking on an outsized role in accelerating this shift away from the hegemony of the collective West, and within the US, what people, academics like to call the imperial core, members of the American right, key influencers turning on Israel for the first time. So we're certainly, there may not have been a decisive military shift yet, but we're witnessing clearly a political and psychological shift that honestly has surprised me in how rapidly it's arrived. So I don't, if there's anything you or Aaron want to add before we move on, but thank you for your analysis and for all your time.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you and Aaron and your colleagues at the Grayzone for the fantastic job that you're doing. And I think what you've been doing over the years has been heroic, and all those others out there, Electronic Intifada, and many others who've been active, especially in the United States and the West, where I know it comes at a price for many people. I just want to thank all of them. And I learned a lot from you and your colleagues and others. And I hope that we'll see better days ahead for the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine, and that ultimately we will find we will reach a stage where across Palestine, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and all of them can live as equal human beings and side by side.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. That's Professor Mohammad Marandi speaking
Thank
to
you.
us live from Tehran. And we'll definitely look forward to your next appearance here at the Grayzone. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
By the way, we can thank U.S. sanctions, I think, for that spotty connection because we're using StreamYard. And to use StreamYard, I think the sanctions regime makes that difficult because the U.S. decides who around the world can use certain platforms and who can't. So thank you to the U.S. sanctions regime for that.
Yeah,
for that
it's
connection.
like how all the middle class and upper class in Venezuela freaked out because they could no longer use Adobe and all these other programs thanks to U.S. sanctions. And a lot of them work in graphic design and so on. So yeah, it affects everything. But we managed to circumvent sanctions with our FSB puppeteers gave us special VPN technology to allow Professor Marandi to pipe in.
But it's always worth thinking about. Like, the word authoritarian is thrown around for all these global South governments. It's never thrown around for the government that decides whether or not hundreds of millions of people around the world who never voted for the U.S. government have nothing to do with it, but yet it's up to the U.S. The U.S. gives itself the right to decide whether or not they can use certain software, certain medicines, anything. Sounds authoritarian to me to decide on behalf of the rest of the planet who can and who cannot have access to the same things everyone has access to.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's pretty authoritarian.
It's authoritarian. It's idiotic, and there will be a price. There is a price for this. You look at what's happening with 5G technology in China. Huawei has begun to at least meet Apple's chip technology, and it's superseding Apple within the Chinese market. And this is doing serious harm to Apple's stocks. Apple stockholders are paying the price for this kind of great power competition that the US is waging with its technology. And it's really hubris and arrogance for the US to think that its technology can't be reverse engineered or simply outpaced by people in other highly educated societies where the US has been seeking regime change. So it's happening in real time. And, we don't, StreamYard is pretty easy to use, but we don't necessarily need it either. So, moving along. Just a quick update from Gaza, since we haven't met in over a week here. As we mentioned, 3 of Ismail Haniya's sons were killed. Professor Marandi points to this as an example of Israeli weakness. Another example of Israeli weakness took place almost on the precise 6-month anniversary of October 7th. And this was the withdrawal of the 98th Division of the Israeli military from Khan Yunis, where they'd been taking fairly heavy casualties. This was, these are Palestinians. Who are heading back to Khan Yunis to their homes. So this is I don't see any other way of viewing this except as a defeat for the Israeli military. Now, the Al-Qassam brigades or Al-Quds, the resistance factions in Gaza, they don't function like a traditional military. They're not holding ground. It's not like, the Battle of Bakhmut, where the Ukrainian and Russian militaries were holding specific neighborhoods and fighting in a kind of trench warfare. What they were doing was simply ceding entire areas to Israel, allowing these soldiers to go. There's nothing they can do to prevent soldiers from going into people's homes and sniffing their children's sweat socks, as we've seen footage of recently this week of this perverted army supported by ultra conservatives like Chris Rufo and Ben Shapiro. They can't prevent that, but what they can do is raise the cost of them being there. And if you parse the coverage of Israel's occupation of Khan Yunis in southeastern Gaza, what you'll see, and the withdrawal of the 98th Division, what you'll see is a lot of references to Israel being unable to maintain their presence because of the fear of taking more bodies. And what we saw in 48 hours before Israel's withdrawal was a very well executed ambush by Al-Qassam. This is all over their channels. I'm not going to show it now because it raises our risk of being even further suppressed and demonetized. And they took out 4 soldiers, through a tunnel ambush. This is what's been happening day after day. So they're gone. Now what Israel's trying to do is possibly create the context for invading Rafah by relieving some of the pressure on the refugee population there, allowing them to come back to Khan Yunis. But as Mohammad Marandi, our guest, pointed out, invading Rafah is going to be a lot more difficult than a much more concentrated area like Gaza City. So that's sort of the update. And this is not good for Israel. It's not a good look for its military after 6 months. Hamas is in full control of everywhere south of the Netzarim corridor that Israel's created to section off the north from central and southern Gaza. They're not going away. I don't know what the U.S. is thinking, Tony Blinken and so on, still pushing this idea of regime change in Gaza. I think we can state clearly now it's not going to happen. The capacity, there were several rocket launches from Khan Yunis immediately after Netanyahu announced the destruction of all Hamas battalions in the area towards Eshkol in southern Israel. I mean, it's just not happening. So we're witnessing in real time the unmasking of the supposedly invincible Israeli army as a paper tiger that's capable of killing the sons of Hamas leadership and winning the war on babies and hospitals, but they're failing in all their goals. And of course, the hostages are not coming out through anything except the negotiation in Qatar.
And that's why they've destroyed every single university in Gaza. They've destroyed so many hospitals, including Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa. By the way, a crime which is totally faded into the background.
Yep.
You know, the Israeli pullback from Al-Shifa was just over a week ago, leaving hundreds of dead bodies and most of the complex destroyed. And how much media coverage of there was that? There was far more attention to the killing of the 7 Western or the 6 Western aid workers with World Central Kitchen. And understandably, that's obviously it's a huge atrocity. It deserves the attention, but destroying Gaza's largest hospital got a fraction of the coverage. And it just shows how the media is on board, and it shows how, exactly, Israel's not fighting a war against Hamas. It's just fighting a war against Gaza's civilians and their infrastructure.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, Al-Shifa is so key here because it was the beginning. Israel introduced this narrative that would enable it to destroy all hospitals and then begin to attack all the centers of life and create a humanitarian crisis immediately after October 7th with its fake infographic cartoon of the command and control centers of Hamas below Al-Shifa. And who was the U.S. journalist who really did the most to advance this? Just pop quiz.
Well, there's people within
Jake Tapper.
Jake Tapper.
Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah. You're the man. So yeah, I mean, Jake Tapper had his byline on a CNN piece claiming that the command and control center was directly under Al-Shifa. This was days before Israel's first invasion. And Jake Tapper, he's never addressed that his story has been completely debunked. And it created the context for some of the worst atrocities we've ever witnessed in our lifetimes. I mean, in a perfect world, Jake Tapper would be on trial in Nuremberg 2.0 for what he's done for this demonic regime. So that was never addressed. That's just never been addressed by Jake Tapper. It's one of the worst pieces of journalistic malpractice we've witnessed out of many since October 7th. And then we have the Israeli narrative of coming back to Al-Shifa. Like right now, as we speak, more corpses are being disinterred from the areas around Al-Shifa. People were executed. We're now learning about a 94-year-old who was burned alive in her home because Israel said evacuate, and now we're gonna torch the entire area. In fact, there's Jason Shawa, who we've interviewed before, who was evacuated from Gaza City with his family, has reported on Twitter that several of his elderly relatives were burned alive, killed in their homes, executed by Israel. I mean, these are just heinous Einsatzgruppen level atrocities, maybe beyond. I mean, it's just sickening. And Israel's narrative is that, well, Hamas had reconstituted itself around Al-Shifa, so they had to come back. Once again, this is a narrative of defeat. After 6 months, after you claimed victory, you claimed an operational hold with the Givati and Golani brigades in northern Gaza, you have to come back and kill everybody all over again and kill a bunch of elderly women in order to dislodge Hamas. You're never, ever going to win like that. And you will just, until you're stopped, you're just going to keep committing these massacres, playing whack-a-mole, trying to get Hamas out. So, I mean, we need to just kind of look at the bigger picture here, which is defeat for Israel, punctuated by more and more massacres. And I mean, Aaron, do you feel like this is well understood in Washington?
Well, yes. Another indication is that Biden finally had to not use U.S. leverage, but suggest that he would for the first time. Right. After saying before forever, you know, John Kirby said there are no red lines. So Israel basically can do whatever it wants. And finally, in the last few days, they've had to finally change that narrative. They've had to say, if we don't see changes to Israel's behavior, then we might do something, which is still nothing, but it's more than what Biden was saying before, which is we'll definitely do nothing because Israel's no red lines. It can do whatever it wants. So I do think that's a reflection of just how horrified the world is with what Israel has done. I mean, it was galvanized by its slaughter of 6 Western aid workers. So we have to acknowledge that there was a racism factor in here, that it didn't matter when Israel slaughtered tens of thousands of Palestinians, but finally when they killed white people, that moved things. But even Biden now has been forced to slightly shift his rhetoric.
Yeah. So it was hard to know what to make of this, but let's hear Biden on a possible policy shift.
Aid to Israel, Mr. President. Pardon me? Did you threaten to stop military aid to Israel? I asked them to do what they're doing. You need to Are you abandoning Israel? What do you stop, man? Are you abandoning Israel?
I mean, there's so many layers there. What is your take on his comment?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not an example of what I was just talking about, because he said, I asked Israel to do what they're doing. So he's actually reaffirming support for the genocide there. But there have been other comments from people like John Kirby saying that at the White House that we've told them that unless we see changes, we're going to have to, rethink our support. And, Biden did call Netanyahu, and just even the threat of possibly using U.S. leverage got Netanyahu to open up the land crossings that he's been blocking for months, which was confirmation of two things. One, that Israel's been deliberately blocking aid. Not that we needed the confirmation, but it was just more evidence of it. And B, that Biden's fully complicit in that, 100%. Because if it just takes one phone call to Netanyahu to get Netanyahu to finally let in hundreds of aid trucks that he's been blocking, it shows that Biden could have gotten that done months ago. He's been taking part in the siege of Gaza. And meanwhile, let me play this clip. This is Mike Johnson. This is the Republican, quote unquote, opposition, who, like, their line is that Biden is now being abandoning. He's abandoning Israel, which is just so laughable.
Regarding Israel, it's not just the border. It's Democrats are weak on Israel as well, and it's their support for Israel. It's rather stunning to us that there's this dramatic shift. Hamas is holding more than 130 hostages, as you know, including Americans, and these people are languishing at the hands of barbaric terrorists, and Joe Biden is, meanwhile, giving ultimatums to Israel, not Hamas. And shamefully, since October 7th, Joe Biden has transformed into a anti-Israel president. There's really no other way to characterize it. He's more concerned seemingly with placating the anti-Semitism in his base than standing with our historic and vitally important ally. And it's not just the White House. No one has forgotten, of course, that Chuck Schumer did the unthinkable by opining on and meddling in Israel's elected leadership. I mean, it's just, these are unthinkable developments. And it's shocking to us, but it continues. Just days ago, over 50 House Democrats called for Biden to withhold arms transfers to Israel. It's wrong and it's dangerous, and it shows the Democrats are losing their moral clarity.
I mean, Mike Johnson's kind of campaigning for Democrats there, for all the people who have been voting uncommitted because of Biden's support for the genocide. He's making the case that Republicans would be even more pro-genocide. I mean, which is hard to imagine, but he's somehow finding a way to make that possible.
Well, it's it's nice to hear Sheldon Adelson speak from beyond the grave in the form of Where's Waldo? I mean, another Christian Zionist tool of Israel. He's the Speaker of the House. I don't even know. I mean, Republican support for Israel is slipping. It's gone down 10 points in the latest, I think it's a Pew poll. It shows support for Israel at 18% for Democrats. So yeah, it would be amazing if it were true what Mike Johnson were saying about Biden being an anti-Israel president at a time when most Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi signed on to that letter that Mike Johnson mentioned. Nancy Pelosi, who accused the protesters, the Palestine Solidarity protesters outside her home, of being controlled by Russia and China. Nancy Pelosi has signed on a letter calling for U.S. to condition military aid to Israel on a ceasefire, on ending this slaughter. So
she said people who call for a ceasefire, she said that's Putin's position, literally.
Right.
So Nancy Pelosi has officially endorsed Putin's position. And she said people who support that might be being paid by Putin. So maybe we need to investigate Nancy Pelosi for being on Russia's payroll, because that's what she also, I mean, it's just unbelievable. She said that she also wanted the FBI to investigate pro-ceasefire protesters for being paid by Russia. So maybe she should include herself on that target list.
Yeah. All roads lead to Putin.
All roads lead to Putin.
We've also seen, well, we're hearing conflicting messages from the administration. I mean, publicly, they're not saying that the policy is shifting. They're under enormous pressure. Everywhere they go, they're being protested. Lloyd Austin yesterday in the Senate was protested heavily by Code Pink.
With Undersecretary of Defense Mike McCord, the department's comptroller.
Case stands at ease until the Capitol Police restore order.
First, even as our budget request.
The committee stands at recess until the Capitol Police can restore order.
Enough. How many children have to die? How many children have to die for you to be satisfied? Enough killing my people. Enough.
I want to address what the protesters raised earlier.
Is Senator
Israel
Tom
committing
Cotton.
genocide in Gaza?
We don't have any evidence of genocide being created.
So that's a no. Israel's not committing genocide in Gaza.
We don't have evidence of that, to
Thank
my
you.
knowledge. Yeah. Also glad to be.
So, huge credit to Code Pink for actually eliciting that question from neoconservative Republican Senator Tom Cotton, himself a huge recipient of donations from Zionist billionaires like Paul Singer. Is there a genocide taking place in Gaza? And Lloyd Austin, preserving his future seat on Raytheon's board, which they've been probably holding for him since he last held it, said, we've seen no evidence. There's no, how can you say you've seen no evidence? I mean, I guess he did disappear for a while without telling even others in the Biden administration. So maybe he's not really paying that close attention. But that was another revealing display from the Biden administration. And, you know, it's getting under their skin. These protests are getting under their skin. They're deploying their lackeys like professional centrist Jonathan Chait. He's sort of the professional left puncher of the new Democrats that emerged under Bill Clinton and still persist. Left-wing authoritarians are shutting down the Democratic Party. This is Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine. Liberals would justifiably freak out if the right was doing this to Biden. That was authoritarian protest right there.
Yeah. So good liberals just shut up and accept genocide. That's what Jonathan Chait is saying. He, by the way, was a prominent member of the Blumenthal cult, huge Trump Russia conspiracy theorist. He wrote that cover story about how, for New York Magazine, about how Trump was likely a Russian asset since 1987, featured by Chris Hayes on a show back in the good old Russiagate days. So
yeah,
that's Blumenthal cult membership, Russiagating and outrage at people who dare to stand up to Genocide Joe for his support for the genocide.
There's Jonathan Chait.
There he is. Yes, that's the
unlikely but possible that Trump has been Russian intel asset since 1987. That's journalism in America. It's possible. It's unlikely. And so anyway, it's not authoritarian to force this policy down the throats of the majority of Democratic Party voters who want a ceasefire. It's not authoritarian to have billionaires like Haim Saban basically control Joe Biden's Middle East policy. It's authoritarian for people who have almost no voice in our political system to go to a hearing on Capitol Hill and interrupt and voice their anger at someone who was previously sort of unknown in national security circles and was just a warm seat on Raytheon's board, the defense secretary, Lloyd Austin. That's authoritarian, but it's happening everywhere. I mean, at the giant festival of narcissism at Radio City Hall in New York, where thousands of Democratic donors gathered to hear Stephen Colbert be the parody of his former self and deliver a softball fundraiser interview for Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, along with performances by paid tools like Queen Latifah. The Radio City Hall was basically besieged by protesters. Hillary Clinton was called a super predator to her face as she exited. And this is getting to them. It's a really unique moment in American politics, and it needs to continue whether there's a ceasefire or not.
Let's look at how Antony Blinken is handling all this protest against his policy. He's still trying to make the case that really all this is just Hamas's fault.
Also be, I think, important that so much of the understandable passion, outrage, and anger directed at Israel for the plight of Palestinian civilians in Gaza.
So he has to acknowledge there that there's understandable outrage at Israel, right? For the what he calls the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, which, you know, is a euphemism for mass murder. But watch how he handles it.
Some of that might also be reserved and directed for Hamas. It remains astounding to me that the world is almost deafeningly silent when it comes to Hamas.
Yes, the world is silent on Hamas, right? I mean, yeah. Hamas has so much global support, according to Antony Blinken.
We would not be where we are had they not chosen to engage in one of the most horrific acts of brutality and terrorism on October 7th. And had they then, having done that, not refused these many, many months to get out of the way of civilians, to stop hiding behind them, to put down their arms, to release the hostages, to surrender.
Just
Where's
surrender.
the outrage there?
Just give up.
I mean,
So-
he's basically he's endorsing the basic logic of terrorism, which is that if you don't do what we want, we're gonna slaughter all your civilians. That's terrorism right there. So he's endorsing that. And again, like, does he really want anyone to like? Does he think anyone can just believe that history began on October 7th? That Hamas just started all this and nothing happened before all that? There wasn't the longest running military occupation in the world going on October 6th. It's just a complete farce, but that's the best he can do, is just pretend as if basically history began on October 7th when Hamas woke up one day, decided to start a war, because why not?
First of all, he always looks like he's walking away from a car accident. Like, he looks just shell shocked.
Yeah.
More than ever. And he doesn't sound confident there. He's essentially admitting defeat. He's frustrated that the world, and he's referring to, by the world, he's including the global South, that's asserting itself at the ICJ, whether it's South Africa or Nicaragua, or just simply the world that is voting and pushing for these ceasefire resolutions that the U.S. has tried to either water down or obstruct. The U.S. is completely alone. Anthony Blinken has presided over the isolation of the United States in a way that none of even Trump's secretaries of state hadn't, and even George Bush's secretaries of state hadn't. And the complete discrediting of what he calls the rules-based order. And as you said, he's still reiterating this hackneyed, disgusting narrative of human shields. When we have the Israeli army itself admitting to using this AI lavender system that was first reported by Yuval Abraham in 972, the Israeli publication, which is AI computer system that generates targets more rapidly than the Israeli military can even approve them or vet them. And the targets are determined, the targeting is determined through a sort of a sub program called Where's Daddy, which ensures that the targets are hit at their most vulnerable point, which guarantees the highest success rate, which is when they're at home with their families, which is why entire families are being wiped off the civilian registry in Gaza. This completely discredits the idea of human shields. It just means that people who maybe are like a plumber or a doctor affiliated with some government ministry somewhere, even just a municipality, maybe they work for the mayor, they're all considered Hamas according to this AI program. And then they're all killed along with their entire family at home. We saw 14 people murdered last night in Rafah in an Israeli airstrike. You look at the images of the dead, it's just a bunch of kids just being burned by the self-proclaimed children of the light. And here's Tony Blinken whining about human shields and complaining that the world should condemn Hamas, and admitting that Israel's doing horrible things at the same time. So if you are Hamas or you're the axis of resistance, you got Tony Blinken right where you want him. He's
the most like choked up, nervous, chuffed maniac I've ever seen. Usually sociopaths have confidence in their rhetoric, in their support for mass murder. He's a little conflicted, but he still spits it out. He gets it out. But yeah, it's just truly sadistic what he's saying.
It's shocking to me too, the way the U.S. press has treated Blinken. I mean, compared to other secretaries of state like Colin Powell, Condi Rice. I mean, they were destroyed for the Iraq war. Tony Blinken's still being protected. It's partly because he has relationships with so many members of the press. He comes from their world.
He was an op-ed writer for the New York Times after the Obama administration. He had pretty much a regular column in the New York Times. And that's where he advocated that Trump undo the Obama policy of not sending javelins to Ukraine. So basically, after becoming an op-ed writer, he was lobbying Trump to basically do what Obama wouldn't do. And so he is a member of that sort of that liberal elite class. the media class. He's probably friendly with many people, and that might explain why. I don't know. Is there a worse Secretary of State? I guess Mike Pompeo was pretty horrible. But Blinken, I mean, what has he done? Like, what diplomacy does he do? He's a complete joke. Everything he says is a lie, and he's bad at doing it. You know, he's not even a smooth operator when he lies through his teeth.
Yeah, I mean, Pompeo was a transparent bozo, so it wasn't a shock that he would get diverted from. He would just be completely diverted from anything remotely resembling diplomacy into culture war tirades against the 1619 Project. And the ridiculous presentations about a clean internet, clean from Chinese influence. It wasn't a surprise that the Koch brothers tool from Wichita, Kansas was going to behave like that. But Tony Blinken what he's doing is he's discrediting the liberal intelligentsia on the world stage. And there's nothing left after that. He is the deep state. He is the establishment. He comes from the Ivy Leagues. He was an opinion writer at Harvard University. He used to posture around as a liberal Zionist, denouncing Menachem Begin at his school paper. And now he is just a symbol of American decline, and there's no hiding it, and corruption, just complete corruption. When he leaves, he will go back into the private sector and make tons of money off this genocide and off the Ukraine proxy war through something like West Exec Advisors. And
big credit to those people who've been camping outside his mansion.
Yeah.
In Maryland, right, or wherever it is in Virginia, there's been a encampment going on, which you've been to, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna put up video of it. I did shoot some video outside Kibbutz Blinken, which has been maintained by some really brave Palestine solidarity activists who'd been there day and night in the mud. It's an amazing scene because they camped out right in front of a $40 million mansion, which is owned by a mysterious LLC directly across from Blinken's mansion on Chainbridge Road. So, when I got there, it was just mud. They were, braving some pretty rough conditions. And these are Palestinians, including Palestinians who have survived the Nakba. Some of them are refugees. And every time a car goes in or out, they douse fake blood around the car. And there's nothing that Blinken and his security team can do to dislodge them. They just held an iftar dinner outside Blinken's house, and they're helping man the tents, which have remained since the suicide / extreme protest of Air Force Airman Aaron Bushnell outside the Israeli embassy. The Israeli embassy is itself working with a thug squad modeled after the thug squads that are blocking aid to the Gaza Strip to try to dislodge these protesters, and they can't do it. So it's, the vice of protest, of popular outrage, of international outrage is tightening directly and physically around Tony Blinken to the point where he just can't go anywhere without seeing it. We could talk about Blinken for the next hour. I mean, he's just a uniquely odious figure. But I want to talk about something that is upsetting him and upsetting the sort of transatlantic regime that preserves U.S. hegemony in Europe and the Middle East, which is the case that Nicaragua is taking to the International Court of Justice, where it alleges that Germany, the number 2 supplier of Israel's armaments and weapons, providing 47% of all military aid to Israel after the U.S., which provides close to 53%, accusing Germany of being complicit in genocide in the Gaza Strip through its support for Israel, and accusing it of violating the 1948 UN Genocide Convention by providing Israel with military and financial aid. Germany, of course, as its reason to exist, has declared support for Israel and this kind of culture of philo-Semitism to be sacrosanct, that it can never break support for Israel or it will not be paying reparations to the quote unquote Jewish people for the Holocaust. And Nicaragua's just upended that entire narrative. It's upended Germany's entire post-war reality. Let's hear a little bit from Nicaragua's opening argument, courtesy of a video made by our friends at Africa Stream.
The Jewish victims in the concentration camps during the Second World War will feel sympathy and empathize with the more than 30,000 civilians, including 25,000 mothers and children massacred so far in Palestine, and the 20,000 children orphaned, and 2 mothers being killed every hour. States like Germany that sympathize with what the state of Israel was meant to represent when it was created should be doing their best to put a stop to what is happening and not continue backing Israel in practice, even though they now, at least in public, perhaps forced by the enormous public outcry, make statements for peace 6 months after the start of the massacre, perhaps also in reaction to the present case before the court. With all due respect to this moral imperative of Germany that identifies defense of Israel as a raison d'etat, there's another less noble reality that perhaps is not known by the generality of the German people. There is also a lucrative quid pro quo involved. German companies involved in the military industry are directly profiting from the situation, as they have seen their share prices rise since 7 October. And they have substantially increased their joint development contracts for weapons with their Israeli counterparts.
Great point. And one of the corruption trials Netanyahu is facing relates directly to German military aid to Israel. He has siphoned off aid from the German arms manufacturers that make the Dolphin-class submarines and provided it to political allies. This is, just consider the insanity of the fact that Germany is providing Dolphin-class submarines with the capacity to fire tactical nuclear weapons, perhaps at Iran, to Israel as reparations for the Holocaust. It's like we're making global war to make up for our Wehrmacht and what it did to Europe and specifically to Jews. It's disgusting, but it's also fueling Netanyahu's corrupt regime, which permeates every aspect of Israeli institutions. So there is a quid pro quo. And as Ben Rubenstein points out, there is precedent here for Nicaragua's case, which is that Nicaragua actually won an ICJ ruling in the past against the U.S., the case concerning military and paramilitaries in and against Nicaragua, where Nicaragua sued the U.S. for orchestrating contra-terrorism against them on April 9th, 1984. Nicaragua's president, Daniel Ortega, was the commander of Sandinista forces and the president at the time after Nicaragua's successful revolution against U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza. The U.S. waged a dirty war on Nicaragua, much like it did on Syria more recently, funded Contras, and mined Nicaragua's harbor through the CIA, and Nicaragua won at the ICJ $17 billion from the U.S. in reparations for the damage that the U.S. sponsored terror did to Nicaragua, and the U.S. refuses to pay till this day. So then there's a German precedent, which is not just the Holocaust, but the Namibian genocide, where Germany pioneered the use of the concentration camp against the Namibian people as a kind of blueprint for the genocide it waged in Europe, cost over 100,000 lives in Namibia. And so there's precedent for this case. The ICJ has taken up the case. It's looking very favorably on the case. And we should also point out that Nicaragua faced down a US-backed coup in 2018, where its economy and country were shut down by violent gangs with the full-throated support and financing of the United States. and it's using this case to basically flex its muscle and flex the muscle of the global South against an empire that will not allow it to have an independent government. And just as Germany is exploiting the post-October 7th reality and the genocide in Gaza to rearm and to position itself as a power on the world stage, it's also using the Ukraine proxy war in a similar way. So this is an extremely significant case. It's a historic case, and we're going to continue watching it. Maybe we'll be interviewing someone from Nicaragua who is at the heart of it. Any thoughts, Aaron?
I don't know much to say on this, but just the obvious that I'm so amazed at these countries, Nicaragua and South Africa before it, who have nothing at all to gain from taking these cases to the ICJ, because in doing so, you're challenging the global hegemon, the US. And when you do that over an issue of such critical importance to the US as its support for Israel, you're going to face consequences. So, and you gain absolutely nothing. There's no material benefit whatsoever. It's purely a humanitarian act to try to intervene this way through the courts, even though you'll face consequences by angering the U.S. And it's amazing to me that victims of U.S. hegemony, Nicaragua especially, but also South Africa, because apartheid South Africa was backed heavily by the U.S. and Israel, that despite all the challenges they face, they're still willing to go and bear these consequences just for the principle of stopping a genocide. And it's all the more symbolic in that they're going after countries that have terrorized them. And I just find that really inspiring. I wouldn't have expected any of these countries to do that. If anything, I thought the state of the Palestinian Authority or maybe one of their regional allies would have done this, but instead it came from far away. And I just there's something very inspiring, something very moving about that.
Yeah, I mean, these are two countries that have a terrible history with the United States, and they haven't forgotten. And the U.S., I mean, right now in Congress, there's a sanctions bill moving forward that aims to destroy Nicaragua's economy. The U.S. government officially seeks regime change in Nicaragua, where the president has a mass base of 2.5 million people who are workers, who are rural peasants, who are Sandinistas. At a certain point, you really have nothing to lose. But just by being yourself, when the U.S. does not want to negotiate, doesn't believe in international law, and is preaching a rules-based order where it makes the rules, and if you don't follow the orders, you get destroyed. Now the U.S. and Germany are paying the price, and it's beautiful to see. Should we do Tucker?
I'll say one more thing. It's also a moment of shame for leftists in the privileged world, in the Western world, who've taken part in demonization efforts against these governments, like Nicaragua. I haven't been involved in this, but you have. I mean, you went to Nicaragua on the ground. You've covered the regime change efforts there in recent years, and you've also countered so much of the propaganda we've seen even in leftist outlets about Nicaragua. A really successful propaganda campaign to basically delegitimize the government completely, to twist the reality of what actually happened on the ground. And you had, you had some leftist outlets, progressive voices taking part in that. And it's an example of why it's important to not be used for propaganda campaigns that seek to delegitimize and stigmatize and undermine governments that actually stand up to U.S. hegemony. I mean, you can see clearly now why Nicaragua has been the target of so much hostility from the U.S. because it does stuff like this. It actually does things on principle, and whatever you think about it internally, that to me is Nicaragua's business. But clearly, anyone that resists U.S. dominance is going to be destabilized. And if you're a journalist, if you're a leftist, maybe reconsider taking part in that.
Yeah, it really was all the ultra left circles centered around academia, the pseudo-socialists, the Trotskyists. We saw it in Jacobin, NACLA, all across the social media. This
Democracy Now! Was terrible on
Democracy Now!
So bad.
Full-throated support from Democracy Now! For regime change in Nicaragua. It only became they once had a debate with Camilo Mejia, but it was I mean, they wouldn't call out what was happening. And I published an investigation showing that the main figures leading this regime change effort in 2018 were funded, trained by the US, were essentially CIA assets through the National Endowment for Democracy. I went to Nicaragua in July 2018 and met just droves of people, too many people to meet, who had been terrorized by US-backed forces, had their family members murdered. I interviewed one guy who was tortured by simultaneously a violent mob and a Catholic priest that dripped burned plastic bags on his face simply because he was a known Sandinista in town. This is what they were dealing with. And meanwhile, the campus ultra left in the US was, cheering this on. Oh, these people are fighting a violent dictator. I saw anarchist factions actually raising money for the Tranquistas, the violent elements in Nicaragua that were shutting down the streets and shutting down highways and the economy. And now it's pretty clear, as with the leftist elements that have been agitating for regime change in Russia, or were demonizing us over Syria, it's so clear now that they're supporting the same system that supports Israel. And the entire Nicaraguan opposition is pro-Israel and waves Israeli flags. All of it, the Chamorro family, all of it. They're hanging out with, when they come to the U.S. after getting exile, sanctuary here because they were assets of the U.S. Then they go hang out with like other U.S. assets for other regime change projects, like what's that lady, Masih Alinejad from Iran? She's been hanging out with Nicaraguan opposition figures. And then they're going to go party with Yeonmi Park, who wants regime change in North Korea. It's all the same system. So when you're agitating for regime change in Syria or Nicaragua or Venezuela or Russia, or you're supporting the Hong Kong rioters, you're supporting the same hegemonic system that has guaranteed Israel a place in the world to commit genocide and billions of dollars of aid. And you are part of the problem, whether you put a Palestine flag in your bio or not. And it's ridiculous to see people with Palestine flags and Ukraine flags in their bios. I mean, you're almost worse than like Zionists because you're insidious. So that's what I have to say. Thank you for bringing that up, Aaron, bringing up a lot of past anger. I thought, like I buried that anger from in the past, because it is refreshing right now to see like a new generation of activists, and also to see kind of a shift in consciousness in the American right about Israel and about American empire. So maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm heartened by all the people who aren't dupes, who just, they see all the propaganda they've been getting about Palestine and they don't buy it. They just reflexively now don't believe what they're told by the New York Times and CNN and the Biden administration, and they reject all of these efforts by Democratic Party hacks to get them to shut up and vote for Biden. And that is a big shift. And maybe we're seeing something similar now on the right, where you have some figures like Candace Owens and Alex Jones. Alex Jones recently called out what Israel's doing as a genocide. He did that before AOC, which is pretty remarkable. And now Tucker Carlson recently did an interview with Munter Isak, who's a Palestinian pastor in Bethlehem. And it got a lot of people on the right very upset.
If you wake up in the morning and decide that your Christian faith requires you to support a foreign government blowing up churches and killing Christians, I think you've lost the thread. Just to end on this, if you had a message for Christian leaders in the United States, whether in government or in churches or just citizens who care about the religion and their fellow Christians, what would it be?
It would be to remind them that when the state of Israel was created, it was not created on an empty land. It was created on a land that had millions of indigenous Palestinians there, including Palestinian Christians. And that state they support, that state they celebrated as a fulfillment of prophecy and a sign of God's state to the Jewish people. For it to become a state, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, were forced to leave and have never returned. churches were closed. A friend of mine did a research and counted more than 30 churches that were closed when Israel was created because Palestinians were expelled from the land. Our numbers continue to be in decline. So we're pleading that come and listen, come and talk to us. And my message to Christian leaders right now is there is a very, very brutal war taking place in Gaza, a war that I described using the word genocide, because it's a war that has used even starvation as a mean. And fellow Christians are suffering because of that war. It's time that Christian leaders recognize that wars is not the way, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. I mean, when will we learn that war does not help? When will we take Jesus's words seriously about being peacemakers, about being merciful? There must be other ways. And so it would be an invitation to listen, to learn more, and to avoid very shallow and simplistic perspectives that are not based on scripture itself, but more based on political equations. And I would plea right now, and I will continue to plead that we need to stop this war in Gaza. It's killing many, many children, women, innocent lives. It has to stop. There must be other ways. And as a follower of Christ, we have to pursue the path of peace and justice, and we have to avoid simplistic polarizations, good and evil. Come and listen, come and understand what's happening. And I plead as a Christian pastor from Bethlehem, I plead that you come and listen.
Wow. I mean, just I've known Tucker for years, like when he was a sort of just a voice of the Bush Republicans in Washington. I just still can't believe what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And, Tucker's compatriots on the right were not happy about this. There's been a huge freak out against him. For example, this guy, David Friedman, to was Trump's ambassador to Israel. He says, Tucker, my friend, before the Palestinians took over Bethlehem pursuant to the Oslo Accords, Bethlehem was under Israeli control and its population was 80% Christian. It was one of the centers of the Christian world. Since Oslo and the resulting Palestinian rule, Bethlehem became 80% Muslims and Christians are afraid. But they don't speak out against the Palestinian Authority because you just can't and survive. Such a malicious lie. First of all, the idea that Bethlehem became 80% Muslim, like, what does he get that from? And that you can't speak out against the Palestinian. If you speak out against the Palestinian Authority's collaboration with Israel in being basically like an arm of the occupation, yeah, the Palestinian Authority will crack down on you. But this idea that like the Palestinian Authority is like now like some sort of like Muslim, like running like some sort of like Islamic regime, it cracks down on Christians. It's such a complete joke. They're very secular and have no interest in religious rule. It's a complete invention.
Yeah, I mean this is the talking point of the ostensibly pro-Trump or right-wing opponents of what Tucker did, is that the Bethlehem, well, it's all the Palestinians' fault. It's the Palestinian Authority that controls it. And I mean, you have to be so submental and have the IQ of a grapefruit to really believe that talking point, because there's a gigantic wall, an apartheid wall, that is impossible to miss in and around Bethlehem that is destroying the Christian community there, along with Israeli raids and settlement construction all around Bethlehem. I've spent a ton of time in Bethlehem. I would always have to go through what is it? Machzon Shloshim, checkpoint 300. Everybody in Bethlehem knows checkpoint 300. It's horrible. And I'd stand behind all these Palestinians who'd be getting photographed and humiliated going through there. and they'd usually wave me through, but sometimes they'd, scan me as well. And then I'd have to catch a ride to Jerusalem on the other side. And so, you're a Palestinian Christian, you can't get to Jerusalem. You can't celebrate Palm Sunday in Jerusalem. You can't be close to the shrines. You can't really be a Christian in your own land because of that wall. David Friedman is a supporter and I think part-time resident of the Beit El illegal settlement in the West Bank. This guy's part of the problem. He's a human cancer on Palestine, lecturing Tucker. So, I mean, and then you have like all the right-wing Gentiles. I mean, David Friedman's a Jewish Zionist, but you have all the right-wing Gentiles attacking Tucker or Candace Owens as well. It really shows what complete, because these are people who preach America first, but in reality, they're Israel first. Let's be real.
100%. Yeah.
Breitbart, that whole, site. Do you have something from Joel Pollack, who's one of the, original members of Breitbart?
Yes. Apparently he was writing
about this guy.
Yeah, me too. Allow me to respond to Tucker's interview here with Monterey Sack by talking about the facts rather than speculating about whether Tucker hates Israel or is an anti-Semite. So I'm not going to speculate that Tucker is an anti-Semite, but I'm just going to suggest it in a really passive-aggressive way. He says he's concerned about Christians. I'll accept that, but there's no excuse for this. A fact about Bethlehem: Christians used to be a majority there. They're now minority. I'm not sure where they get that from, but anyway, the Palestinian Authority has been Islamizing the city since taking control of Bethlehem 30 years ago. Israeli occupation, he puts occupation in quotes, is hardly the primary issue. Another fact: Bethlehem has become an anti-Semitic city under Palestinian control, far worse to Jews and even to Christians. In 2007, I was told not to speak Hebrew there. In 2023, I was told to remove my yarmulke or cover it with a hat. In the birthplace of Jesus, a Jew. Well, first of all, I'm just going to mute myself while this. Yeah, well, look, I'm sorry if you can't wear your yarmulke, but if you're a member of the settler colony that's terrorizing Palestinians and acting in the name of the Jewish people, it's understandable that maybe people, if this actually happened, I can't take his words on faith, but let's assume that did happen. I can't assume that people who are being terrorized by the Jewish people, by the state that acts in the name of the Jewish people, are going to be receptive to having Jewish people come to visit. I mean, if you don't like that reception, stop terrorizing and stealing their land. It seems pretty self-explanatory. If he's even telling the truth, because by the way, when I visited Bethlehem, I mean, I don't wear a kippah, but it's pretty clear I'm Jewish, and no secret of that. I've never, there's never been the hint of an issue. People just understandably don't like settlers.
Yeah.
I
mean, I got like once I was walking through Silwan, which is an area of occupied East Jerusalem where there's just insane Israeli settler activity. They're hiring private guards. They're physically taking over homes, forcing people out. There's demolitions all the time of people's homes. Some people are forced to demolish their own homes so they don't have to pay you actually have to pay the Jerusalem municipality after they demolish your home because they say, well, it was illegal. And yeah, some kids threw some little pebbles at me, basically some rocks, because they thought I was a settler, because I was I had a backpack on, and I just I guess I looked like one. And then the adults from the community scared off the kids, and I walked through unmolested. But that's, Joel Pollack's basically just a pure example of entitlement. When he was at Harvard University, he's a huge fraud. When he was at Harvard University, he worshiped Cornel West. I did a piece with Mark Ames about this back in the day. He wanted to be Cornel West's an intern, and he just worshiped him. He participated, I think, in racial justice rallies at Harvard, and he could never really get close to Cornell, so he became a whack job Zionist, and Alan Dershowitz adopted him because Alan Dershowitz was at Harvard Law School and would use him kind of as a proxy to go into Harvard classes and interrupt and disrupt on behalf of Israel. He brought in a piece of metal into one class and claimed it was a rocket fired into Sderot, and slammed the piece of metal down on his desk to shut down debate on Israel-Palestine. I mean, that's who he was. And he wound up at Breitbart. And this really says it all about right-wing media. I'm kind of working towards a larger point. Right-wing media that claims to be America first, a lot of it, much of it was actually founded by the Israel lobby or founded in Israel. Can't find the article right now. If you're listening or watching, you'll easily find it. I think it's by Jim Hoft, and it's about how Breitbart was literally founded in Jerusalem during a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu and Andrew Breitbart, who is no longer with us because he reached his tweet limit. And several other of the Breitbart hacks. I think Steve Bannon might have been there. And I mean, you look at the relationship between Breitbart and Israel, it's like they literally work for Netanyahu. Netanyahu hires ex-Breitbart journalist Aaron Klein as his campaign chief. This was in 2021. I mean, crazy. They're just owned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what about Charlie? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, just like there's something so just obnoxious about someone like Joel Pollack even setting foot in Bethlehem, let alone complaining about that he can't wear his yarmulke there, if indeed that's what happened. Because can somebody from Gaza or the West Bank, can they go to Tel Aviv? Can they go to their ancestral homes from which their ancestors, or maybe even them, if they were alive during the Nakba, that they were expelled from by Zionist forces? And he's allowed to go wherever he wants because he's an American Jew. He can set foot in Bethlehem, and he has the gall to complain that maybe he got some bad looks because he was wearing his kippah. There's just something so, it's just they're so entitled, and they feel they own a land that they have actually no connection to. But the indigenous people there, who are uncomfortable by the presence of settlers, they're the ones who have to be demonized. And of course, their rights to visit where they want aren't even considered, because he takes for granted that Israel has the right to cage the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank.
Yeah. And back to the point that I was making about right-wing media. I mean, you can tell who's controlled opposition and who is not. There are all these right-wing influencers who don't seem to be very talented. I just can't see what it is about them that makes them so compelling. Like Charlie Kirk, this guy just came out of nowhere. He was cultivated to be one of the key Trump influencers. I don't even know how Trump knew who he was, but he came out through the David Horowitz Freedom Center with right-wing Zionist money. And then he's doing all these trips to Israel, hanging out with Im Tirtzu, which is basically the campus wing of Netanyahu's Likud operation, completely controlled. Then you have like the Manhattan Institute, a base of neoconservatism. That's where Chris Rufo comes from. And so many of these other figures. Who is this guy who was just on Joe Rogan, who I've never heard of? He's sort of like like a black neoconservative that they're propping up.
Coleman Hughes.
Yeah, Coleman Hughes. He's like a
huge dupe of the Hamas mass rape story. He chided me for daring to challenge it back when it first came out. He said nothing since it all fell apart, by the way. But anyway.
Yeah, he's from the Manhattan Institute. They're like, okay, well, we need we're looking for black commentators to denounce DEI and be pro-Israel. We got a problem there. So here you go. Here's a guy who's like slightly more intelligent and less funny than Jesse Lee Peterson. I mean, it's all just the whole right as it's been constructed in the US is just like pseudo. Everything's fake. They have like all these fake think tanks that right-wing billionaires created. They have all these fake endowed scholars they're trying to get fake university presidents. I mean, not that they're not all kind of fake, but they're like trying to dislodge them with billionaire money. And then they just want to ram through their agenda. It's, it's an emulation of the establishment, but behind it all is tons and tons of Zionist money. It has to be said. So when Tucker Carlson is coming out on a platform that's harder to control, he has his own money, his own backers. He's kind of his own man. I'm not saying I obviously don't come from the same perspective as him, but he's moving. That is a huge threat. And it's not just a threat to the personalities of the right. It's a threat to the forces behind them. It's also a threat to the way that the Israel lobby has tried to influence the Christian church in America. Pastor John Hagee, one of the biggest Christian evangelical pastors, not because he's particularly insightful or spiritual, but because he has a ton of money. This big church in San Antonio is kind of a faith healer, a Pentecostal. He's propped up by the Israel lobby. It was AIPAC that set up, I reported this back at the time in like 2007. They helped set up Christians United for Israel. When I went to their first conference, John Hagee had all of these PR agents running around trying to manage us who did not come from the Christian church or the Christian community. They were Jewish Zionist PR agents who worked for this Israeli thug named Ron Tarosian in New York, who was basically, just an Israel lobby guy. So who is John Hagee representing, really? And that's where I think this rebellion is coming from. It's also coming from just sincere outrage by Tucker or Candace Owens at just watching babies being butchered. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. How could you just watch that day after day and not be disgusted by what Israel is and what it's doing, or seeing the soldiers just taunt you on TikTok, just reveling in the bloodbath that they've created? I don't know. You have to be there. You have to be incentivized somehow to continue to go along with this and attack Tucker for simply interviewing Munter Isaac. And there is another point to make, I guess, about evangelical Christianity in the U.S. here and the Christian right, which is something real about it since it emerged from the influence of Carnival Barker, John Nelson Darby, which is that they don't really see the Palestinian Christians of Nazareth or Bethlehem, where Jesus is from, who are direct descendants of the apostles, as Christian, because they were not born again in the blood of the Lamb, as you're supposed to be in evangelical American Christianity. They just see them as Arabs. They kind of have basically the evangelical mega church in the US is just a base of imperialism, and there is an endemic racism there towards Palestinians. So I think this interview is a real breakthrough, not just for political reasons, but to hear Munter Isaac express the liberation theology perspective of an evangelical Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem who sees the cross as a symbol of the Calvary that Palestinians have experienced, the suffering of Jesus as akin to the suffering that Palestinians have experienced, I think will appeal to a lot of younger Christians in the US who are moving away from the imperial kind of Constantinian vision of the pastor John Hagees and the Franklin Grahams and the Jerry Falwell Juniors and all that corruption that comes with it. I think this is a real breakthrough, and there's nothing that can be done to stop it.
The whole thing is part of a pattern. Like, who was the U.S. at war with in Central America in the 1980s? A lot of it was they were against the church, because the church in Central America was so often on the side of the poor. And movements that try to support the poor majorities of the country, that was a target of the U.S. So, for example, when Archbishop Romero was assassinated in El Salvador, even U.S. nuns were assassinated, were killed, and there was some church solidarity in the U.S. with Central America, but not nearly enough, and the political class completely ignored them and supported their murders. Same thing with Syria. Who were the so-called moderate rebels slaughtering the rebels that were armed by the U.S. Via the CIA and their allies? Who are they targeting? It was minorities, including Christians. I went to that church is the town called Malula in Syria? Is that what it's called? Yeah. Where that was taken over by Al Qaeda, and all the this historic church desecrated. These U.S.-backed militants stealing relics from the church, putting it on the black market. No outrage whatsoever from these evangelical Christians in the U.S. and their representatives in Congress. And so this is like, even in Palestine, the birthplace of Jesus, it can't stir any immoral outrage from these people. Very, very
Malula is the only
mascot
place in the
from it.
world. Yeah. Malula is the only place in the world where Aramaic is still spoken, and the town's residents were used as extras from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, just because he needed Aramaic speakers. And you know who defeated Al-Qaeda there? It was the Syrian army, local Christian militias, but Hezbollah played a key role there in saving that Christian community. And Israel, of course, is trying to destroy them. Efraim Rios Montt, the former dictator of Guatemala, he was an evangelical Christian who was coached by evangelical Christian leaders in the U.S. To counter figures, liberation theology figures like Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, who were seen as a threat to empire. And it, this persists today. So this was, I think, a major intervention by Tucker. And people can change. It doesn't mean Tucker is going to change into some like left-wing progressive anti-imperialist who goes and delivers water to dying migrants on the border. I don't think that's going to happen. But we live in the US. I'm going to stay here and make whatever change I can. And I'm going to, and I don't know. I remember some like dweebs attacking me for having dinner with Tucker once or something. Well, I mean, I don't really feel like I have anything to apologize for. I'll have dinner with anyone who wants to talk to me about Palestine and learn more about it. And they can feel free to run away and leave the U.S. But I'm going to be here, and I think things are changing. At least we're raising consciousness here in the heart of the empire, and that's something I'm proud of, and I'm happy to witness this change. If we do a little Ukraine, or gone over 2 hours, but
yeah, well, listen, the tide is turning in Ukraine, everybody. You know why? Because guess who is on the case for advocating more U.S. weapons, for supporting Joe Biden's $61 billion request to prolong the Ukraine proxy war? There's a headline in CNN: Opinion: Congress must let Ukraine win, says Barbara Streisand, Sean Penn, Imagine Dragons, Timothy Snyder,
oh my God,
and other luminaries. Opinion by more than 35 activists, artists, scholars, and others. So don't worry, everybody. Ukraine is going to bounce back because they have Barbara Streisand, Timothy Snyder, Sean Penn, and Imagine Dragons on their side. Imagine Dragons is a band, I think.
Yeah. Where are the luminaries, by the way?
Yeah.
It should say just and luminaries.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's there to say about Ukraine at this point? Yeah, Zelensky recently lowered the age of conscription to 25 under heavy pressure. He has to do that because there's just no one who wants to fight anymore. So now he has to lower the age for which people are going to be forced off to go die. Kurt Campbell, who's a senior State Department official, he recently let it slip that, Anthony Blinken loves to say that Russia has been weakened, that Russia has been depleted militarily. His deputy, Kurt Campbell, at the State Department admitted one day later, after Blinken said that that's a complete lie.
Clearly into view, Richard, as the conflict in Ukraine. I think we have assessed over the course of the last couple of months that Russia has almost completely reconstituted militarily. And after the initial setback.
So if that was hard to hear, he says that we have assessed that Russia is almost completely reconstituted militarily. Well, meanwhile, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden are saying that Russia's lost. They've been weakened. He's saying that Russia's military is almost completely reconstituted. So even from the narrow point of view that sees Ukrainians as cannon fodder, which is the U.S. outlook, even accepting that view that Ukraine can just be used to weaken Russia, even that strategic goal has been a complete failure for the U.S.
I mean, that's not just anybody acknowledging it. It's Victoria Nuland's replacement, or the person who superseded her.
Yeah. I'll play one more clip. This is David Cameron, though. He still insists, though, that actually Russia is losing and that it's okay to use Ukrainians as cannon fodder. He pretty much says it out loud.
That it is extremely good value for money for the United States and for others. Perhaps for about 5 or 10% of your defense budget, almost half of Russia's pre-war military equipment has been destroyed without the loss of a single American life. This is
even if that's true, that half of Russia's pre-military equipment has been destroyed, which I don't know where he gets that from. I assume it's false, but let's say it's true. Well, they've replaced it with more modern equipment because Russia's military production has obviously met its goals and has been really efficient. I mean, no one denies that now. So yeah, if their pre-invasion equipment was destroyed, they've replaced it with more modern equipment, and that's why Kurt Campbell just said that Russia is almost completely reconstituted militarily. And then he says without the loss of a single American life. Well, how many Ukrainian lives have been lost for a goal of weakening Russia, which hasn't even succeeded?
American life. This is an investment in United States security. So that's what I would say on the issue of.
So there you go. He's admitting that Ukrainians are expendable for the goal of bleeding Russia, which, by the way, as Kurt Campbell admitted, hasn't even succeeded. So that's where we're at.
Well, on the Aaron, let me just highlight something you tweeted, which is just an update on the achievements of Ukraine proxy warriors. This is a Washington Post headline. With no way out of a worsening war, Zelensky's options look bad or worse. I think I saw this on the cover. This was on the front page of the Washington Post. This was something that was inevitable from the beginning. What's your take on Zelensky's options?
I don't know, Miami or I don't know, Israel. I know his family actually owns property in Israel, and he, after October 7th, he was so determined to express support for Israel, he wanted to fly there to show his solidarity. But the Israeli government turned that down. So I don't know. In terms of Zelensky's options, I think it's Miami or it's Tel Aviv.
Well, he wanted their weapons, and Israel didn't want to take a public position against Russia for obvious reasons. Syria, big Russian population in Israel, etc. But the weapons didn't come. They're not. And I don't know how many weapons can you use, or Patriot batteries can you effectively use when your army, your manpower is so depleted, and you're having to lower the draft age, draft women. There are young women showing up in Ukrainian military graveyards. There just doesn't seem to be a lot there, which really emphasizes the sickness of David Cameron's comments, which is, well, we're making money off this and we're not dying.
Exactly. Yeah. And Ukraine, the whole Ukraine war is a good example of how, even in purported democracies, elected leaders ultimately don't have any power when it comes to these critical matters of war. So Zelensky was elected on a peace platform in Ukraine. Huge majority of the country votes for him. He gets over 70% of the vote. The only region that doesn't vote for him in the majority is Western Ukraine, which is the heartland of Ukrainian ultranationalism, the Banderites, people who support Stefan Bandera, who support neo-Nazi militias like the Azov Battalion. He has this huge mandate for peace. He does take some steps to implement it. But every time he does, the ultranationalists flex their muscle. They threaten to kill him. There's that famous line which we quote all the time from the head of Right Sector, who said that if Zelensky makes peace with the Russian-backed Eastern Ukrainians, he'll hang from a tree. He won't lose his popularity ratings. He'll lose his life. So threats like that make it impossible for Zelensky to do anything. Plus, in the U.S., you have the national security state, which also won't let him do much to implement the Minsk Accords. They are lobbying him against it. They impeached Donald Trump, who's the elected president in the U.S., when he tries to actually stop sending weapons to Ukraine. And while he's also talking about supporting the peace process there, of course, the charge was that he was doing all this to compel an investigation of Joe Biden and of the origins of Russiagate. But they won't let, and of course, and Trump also faces the pressure of being framed as a Russian asset. So Trump's elected, he can't do anything. Zelensky's elected, he can't do anything. Barack Obama, he didn't want to send weapons to Ukraine either, but everybody around him wanted to, including Victoria Nuland, Antony Blinken, and Joe Biden. And they maneuvered basically around Obama to undermine his own policy as well. So in all these countries, whether it's the US and Ukraine, it just shows when you go against the forces of war and militarism, doesn't, like, you're going to be undermined no matter what you actually want to do. And Zelensky's he's now look at him now. I mean, he's just, his own aides say he's delusional. There was that article in Time magazine late last year saying that he's out of touch, that he's not listening to reality. He signed a decree ruling out negotiations with Russia so long as Putin is in power. He's become a complete he's unhinged. And look at Macron too. Macron before France was trying to make some kind of deal with Russia, trying to give diplomacy a chance, or at least giving the appearance that he was. And now he's talking about sending troops into Ukraine, which of course I don't think he'll actually do. So in all these countries, no matter what your initial intentions are as an elected leader, the pro-war forces always win.
Yeah, and just look at what's happening on the battlefield. It's Russia's advancing. We don't know how far they're going to go, but they're advancing toward Chasiv Yar. And this is the town which on its own is sort of insignificant, but it's west of Bakhmut, which Russian forces already took. And it's the significance of Chasiv Yar is that it's on the high, it's at a high point. So it provides further opportunity for advances towards other areas. Konstantinivka, for example, which put other parts of the Donetsk Oblast at greater risk for Ukraine. The whole point of Bakhmut, its strategic significance was it was a transportation hub. And so you're cutting off transportation lines, rearmament lines for the Ukrainian military as Russia continues its march through Donetsk. And I don't know what else Ukraine can do to retrench its positions after that. I don't know what the collective West can do, but the military disaster continues to play out before our eyes without that much coverage. I think since the fall of Avdiivka and Bakhmut, the Western media is kind of downplaying a lot of these continued losses. We just don't know how far the Russian military is going to go. Ukraine doesn't have any ability to do another counteroffensive. It's fighting a completely defensive war of survival. And the longer the West keeps pushing it, the more likely it is to be just kind of a rump state. And then the West will start moving towards Moldova and making that, its base of anti-Russian operations. Total disaster. I mean, this is a defeat on par with Vietnam, but we haven't seen how far the defeat will go.
The counteroffensive, which was so widely hyped, months of planning, a lot of money and equipment poured into that. It was such a failure that, listen to this from the New York Times. They're talking about the view from the Pentagon. At the Pentagon, some officials say they do not consider last summer's efforts to have been a counteroffensive at all. So the counteroffensive was such a failure that the Pentagon can't even call it a counteroffensive. That's how bad it was. I mean, it's horrible. And so given that that was like Ukraine's big shot, they put a lot of time, planning, money into it. How could possibly Ukraine do any better now that they've lost so many people and so much equipment? But yet, look, in Congress right now, it looks as if Mike Johnson, House Speaker, is going to cave and give Biden what he wants, another $61 billion to prolong the war. I'm not sure if that will have any immediate impact, but what it will do is put a lot of money into this Ukraine proxy war for years to come. So that goes towards funding, whoever's left to fight Russia or fight the authorities that Russia might help install in eastern Ukraine, that they'll be around for that. So we're looking at just like a long-term conflict, maybe on a lower scale, but still a war.
And a war within a potential next Trump administration between Trump and his people and the entrenched elements that want to keep this war going, because Trump is campaigning on ending it, which would make sense and would save Ukrainian lives, save Russian lives, and would save more humiliation for the empire. Just imagine a Russian march through Odessa. They're going to start. They could start bombing the bridges on the Dnieper River next. They could get to Transnistria. I mean, just imagine the potential humiliation for the U.S. on the horizon if it doesn't just end this and force negotiations.
There was a really alarmist piece in the Washington Post the other day. Inside Donald Trump's secret long shot plan to end the war in Ukraine, foreign policy experts and some Republicans warned pressuring Ukraine to cede land would reward Putin. So yeah, apparently this article claims, with actually no evidence whatsoever, it's based on hearsay of something some Trump associate said at some gathering. It's really, there's actually no evidence for it, but they say that Trump's plan is to, force the negotiation in which Ukraine does cede some territory to Russia, eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And they're saying what a disaster this would be for Ukraine and all that stuff. Even if you look at polls in Crimea, majority of the population wants to be a part of Russia. In the eastern Ukraine, I think it's a little bit more mixed, but you do have a base of support there for Russia. But regardless, if you don't like that outcome, then what you should have done is gotten Ukraine to agree to the Minsk Accord, to implement the Minsk Accords, which would have kept all of eastern Ukraine under Ukrainian sovereignty. But the problem is, and this isn't talked about enough, the ultra-nationalists in Ukraine and Zelensky, they didn't want that territory actually back. They actually didn't want it back, I don't think, because they knew that territory, the people there actually want ties with Russia, and they don't support the ultra-nationalists. So I think one of the reasons Minsk was sabotaged is because people like the right sector and Azov and all these powerful, they don't actually want to have these Ukrainians living in their own country. So they forced basically this hot war to happen. And if the U.S. didn't want this outcome where Ukraine might lose now more land to Russia, rather than fueling a proxy war there, as they've done since 2014, they could have pressured Ukraine to implement the Minsk Accords, which would have kept all of eastern Ukraine under Ukrainian jurisdiction. It just would have recognized the rights of Russophile Ukrainians there, which for ultranationalists was a non-starter.
Well, and if there's a second Trump administration, there's the Russiagate narrative has expended itself, and it won't be available as a weapon to criminalize diplomacy. I think Trump will be entering office with more ability to reinitiate some sort of diplomacy with Russia, maybe with a less buffoonish kind of summit with Putin, which walked right into the trap that was set for him. But it's going to have to be done at some point. And I mean, you just look at the way the Western media is selling this war, and you can just see the desperation and the tragedy of it for Ukrainians. I mean, this is Vogue magazine. Ukraine today, it's basically like children. I mean, these are like adolescents and a woman. They're promoting the war. They're promoting women in the war, fighting on the front lines, which, this isn't saying women shouldn't be in the military or whatever. It's just that when you've depleted your manpower, you're increasingly resembling the German army in 1944, 1945, when Hitler was bringing young boys and old men into the ranks to prop up a zombie army. And now they're bringing young women and they're glamorizing it in Vogue. This is disgusting. Wow. There are hipsters in the army with kind of like MS-13 Nazi tattoos. That's nice. Weird vibes in Vogue. They look like dead young people.
Yeah, it's like it looks like a promotion for sending these young kids off to die. That's
where we're at. Yeah. That's where we're at right now on Madison Ave with the masters of PR the marketers of this war is they're marketing young people dying in large numbers in a slaughterhouse to pay Victoria Nuland's salary. to keep Lloyd Austin's seat on Raytheon on Raytheon's board warm.
Yeah.
Sick. I mean, absolutely sick. I think that's should be all for today. I got to go.
All right. Well, listen, thanks for tuning in. Please like this stream if you haven't already, and you can support the Grayzone at the links on your screen. And yeah, this was a great episode. Thank you, Max.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us. And I mean, again, a huge supportive audience, great comments, and thank you all for all the support, for supporting any way you can. What is the date today? It's April 10th. It's April 10th. So 6 months of genocide. Julian Assange is still being tortured in prison. Kit Clarenberg still banned from Twitter X. And we'll be back next week. Viva Sandino. Peace.
Peace.